One of the most important systems to learn in EFT is weapon modification. But in order to understand how to build a weapon, you need to learn all of the associated stats and performance modifiers as well. So today, we'll be going over everything you need to know to become confident with weapon modification in Tarkov. Before we get into it, you can find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/JohnBusak or on TikTok under the same name. I figured the best way to start this guide would be to introduce the primary gun stats you'll need to understand in EFT. We'll start with the two most commonly discussed stats: recoil and ergonomics. Ergonomics, or ergo for short, affects a few different weapon handling mechanics: aim down sight speed, the volume of aiming down sights, and the rate at which arm stamina drains while aiming down sights. Higher ergonomics means faster ADS speed, quieter weapon movement, and slower arm stamina drain while ADSing. Recoil is pretty self-explanatory and is split up into vertical and horizontal stats. The lower these recoil values, the less bouncy a gun will feel when firing multiple shots. When a weapon's recoil is affected by parts or ammo, both the vertical and horizontal stats are scaled at the same time. Most often, you'll hear people refer to a weapon's recoil by its vertical value, since that's usually the lower of the two numbers. It's also worth noting that two different types of weapons with the same recoil values does not mean they will feel the same. For example, a 50 recoil M4 will feel much different than a 50 recoil AKM. There are other stats which are not visible to us, which dictate recoil patterns and overall weapon feel when firing. There are also many less commonly discussed weapon stats. Weight, for example, affects ADS speed and arm stamina drain, but typically isn't considered too much when building a weapon, as ergo is the primary modifier affecting these stats. Accuracy, which is measured in MOA, determines how consistent shots will be if you were to aim and shoot at the exact same point. A higher MOA means that there will be a greater variation in where shots will land when aimed at the same exact point. An MOA of 1 means that at 100 yards is a 1-inch range in which a round will impact when shot. This means that MOA is particularly important when shooting at greater distances. Muzzle velocity is one more stat worth mentioning, as various components will affect it when modding a weapon. It mainly helps determine how much a bullet will drop at significant distances, but this can also be further affected by the type of round being used. If you don't yet know how ammo stats work in EFT, I highly recommend checking out my video on that topic as well. Now that we've gone over the basics of gun stats, we should move on to the different methods the game has for modifying weapons. The first you'll be introduced to is the inspect window. In your stash or inventory, you can double-click on a gun or right-click and hit inspect to open the inspect window. You'll see all the stats we mentioned earlier, as well as all the attachments and slots available on the gun. In order to remove a part, you can click and drag it off the gun slot or do the reverse to add a part. Certain components you will not be able to modify while in a raid or while equipped. You'll see this warning when hovering over such components while they're faded out. You can also see if a part can be modified while in raid in its inspect screen. The next screen you can use for modifying a weapon can be accessed by right-clicking the gun and selecting modding. This screen is only available once you've unlocked the workbench in your hideout. You'll see your weapon appear now at a much larger scale with all the available modifications expanded around it. Up top, you'll see a few checkboxes that let you enable or disable visibility of the different categories of parts. Within each of these component dropdowns, you'll be able to instantly modify parts of your gun, similar to how you would in the inspect window. Each dropdown will only show compatible parts which you currently have loose somewhere in your stash. The third way of modifying a weapon, also my preferred way, is the Edit Preset screen. This can also be accessed by right-clicking the weapon and selecting Edit Preset. You'll be presented with a screen very similar to the modding screen we just looked at, but with a few important differences. In any of the component dropdowns, you'll no longer just see only compatible components that are in your stash. You'll now see any compatible components that you've examined before. If you select any of these components, owned or not, they won't automatically be attached to the gun. After modifying your build, you'll have to click the puzzle piece on the left side of the screen to confirm your choices and assemble. You'll be presented with a list of any chosen components you don't currently own, which you can ignore or proceed to a purchase screen. By default, you'll see only offers from traders, but you can disable this filter up top to view offers from players as well. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see the total price required to complete your purchase, as well as the ability to purchase all listed parts. After purchasing, you can return to the weapon modding screen and re-click the puzzle piece assemble button to build the gun. I prefer this edit preset screen over the basic modding screen because I rarely have all the parts I need to complete my builds. I also like that I can cycle through different parts while not actually confirming any choices until I'm ready. You can also expand the stats window to check how different components will affect your build as you hover over them, in order to dial in the exact stats you're shooting for. While we're on the topic of the edit preset screen, I should also mention that you have the ability to save presets. You can do so in the top left corner of the screen, and then access these presets later on by clicking the presets button in the bottom right corner of the screen while outside of raids. Next, let's talk about the types of parts that guns are made up of. To preface this, you do not need to have a deep understanding of real-life gun modification to make sense of Tarkov's gun building. While Tarkov's gun building is more complex than any other game out there, it does make it easy for you to understand compatibility and functionality. Let's start off simple. If a gun's icon has a red overlay, it's not currently functional and you may not be able to equip it. It may have incompatible ammo in its magazine, or more related to the focus of this video, it may be missing an essential component. Every gun in EFT has a set of parts which must be assembled to the gun in order for it to be functional. Examples of these on an M4 would be a barrel, pistol grip, or a handguard. If one of these parts is missing, you will not be able to equip the gun. You can easily identify which part is missing in the modification or edit preset screen by looking for which dropdown is highlighted in red. You also may occasionally see that you'll be unable to attach a certain part because it conflicts with another part already attached to the gun. If a part is faded out on the modding screen, hover over it and the pop-up will inform you of which part is conflicting. You'll also see similar pop-ups whenever you try to just drag and drop a part onto a gun in your stash. With any given part, you can view what guns you have that it's compatible with by opening its inspect window and hovering over the arrow next to compatible with available. This will open up a small drop-down listing every gun you currently have which this part has the potential to be added to. If you don't have any compatible guns available, you can use linked search on the part to find what gun or part it's directly compatible with. Moving on from compatibility, we can talk about how different components affect stats, as well as other factors worth considering. Stated earlier, the two most primary stats that are considered when building a gun are ergonomics and recoil. Typically, the lower recoil that you shoot for, the lower your ergonomics are going to get. Longer builds will usually have lower recoil, but low ergonomics, while shorter, more compact builds will have very high ergonomics, but less desirable recoil. For any given part, you can view how it affects different stats on its inspect screen. Pistol grips will affect purely ergonomics. The more you spend, the more of an ergo boost you get. Foregrips, stocks, and handguards affect both recoil and ergonomics. Handguards will also determine if and what foregrips or tactical devices can mount on your weapon. Muzzle devices, such as compensators or suppressors, have an effect on recoil and ergo as well. Suppressors will prevent muzzle flash and reduce weapon sound, as well as usually provide a solid reduction in recoil, but almost always come with a hefty reduction in ergonomics. Tactical devices, such as lasers or flashlights, come with a very slight ergonomics reduction, but have a heavy effect on recoil reduction when point firing, despite it not being listed in their stats. Barrels will affect weapons based on length, as stated earlier. Longer barrels have greater recoil reduction, but more of an ergonomics reduction. Gas blocks also affect recoil and ergo. Charge handles will purely affect ergonomics, and iron sights will also have a slight effect on ergo. Magazines will obviously affect how many rounds your weapon can hold at a time, but will also have an effect on ergo. For any other components, always use the inspect screen or look at the stats window on the modding screen to see how it'll affect your build. Lastly, I'd like to talk about types of builds. You'll often hear the terms meta and budget thrown around pretty frequently when talking about builds. But at what point is a gun considered meta? And wouldn't one player's budget be different from the next? In Tarkov terms, meta is usually reserved for guns that have best-in-slot parts to get the lowest possible recoil while retaining as much ergo as possible. For budget builds, 30,000 rubles may be budget for some, and 130,000 may be budget for someone else. For me personally, budget really depends on the gun. A budget M4 may be anything under 200k, while a budget MP7 may be 70k. But just because you spend an extra 100,000 on a gun doesn't mean you'll get the same jump in performance that you did from the first 100,000 you spent on it. Many best-in-slot parts are purely priced at the high price they are because of rarity, as well as simply their status of being the best. For example, the basic Strike Industries Advanced Buffer Tube provides a +2 ergonomics boost, -4% recoil, and -2% durability burn, while the red variant has the same exact stats, but with +5% accuracy and +2 to muzzle velocity added. The basic version is sold for 11k from Mechanic, while the red version is sold for nearly 100k typically. All the guns that you can use these tubes on already have extremely high accuracy and bullet speed, so is it really worth an extra 90k for such a subtle stat change? Well, that's for you to decide. I highly recommend unlocking at least level 1 shooting range in your hideout so you can test out your builds. Figure out what guns you're comfortable with. Are you more of a long-range player? Then maybe a semi-auto gun, such as an SR25, would fit you well. If you like close range, maybe you'd want to run a P90. Once you figure out what gun you like, try to see how its stats are affected in the edit preset screen by testing out different parts. Then, check the price and repeat until you find a balance between stats and budget. I also want to very quickly mention the topic of durability. The lower durability of a weapon, the less accurate it will be, and the higher chance it will have of malfunctioning. Certain gun parts, such as suppressors, will cause a higher durability burn to a gun when being used. Durability will also be drained more quickly when multiple rounds are fired in rapid succession, as the muzzle will quickly overheat. Keep this in mind when you run a gun for multiple raids. I highly recommend always repairing your gun between every raid in order to keep it as functional as possible. Personally, I avoid running guns once their durability is below the high 80s, as malfunction chance continuously increases the lower the durability gets. And that's going to be it for this video. I tried to hit everything you need to know when building guns in EFT, since it is pretty complex, but without going so deep that it becomes confusing. Hopefully I did well and you learned a few things along the way. But thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.